Most STEM majors are required to take certain levels of physics, and many aren't happy about these requirements.
PTSD right now.
What about these particular classes makes them so hard? Why are students so often afraid of taking physics classes or keen about putting them off? These questions are hard to answer, but perhaps some insight can be shed on them by looking at the gap between physics and math, or trying to explore some of the reasons why physics is so challenging. My name is Amelia Cuomo, and in the next few minutes I will be sharing some interview clips that could explain a bit more about why some students think physics is so difficult. First, I asked a bit about math background and what was remembered as difficult parts of math class growing up.
Well, I always really enjoyed math, and it was always my strong suit until about Calc 1, and I blame it on my professor, actually, because he only taught us theorems. He would write theorems on the board for about an hour, and that was the class. And I think stats was difficult just because the real-world application for me was sort of a disconnect there.
That is Cooper Breed.
I'm from Syracuse, New York. Woo, New York. I'm majoring in biology, singing Geneseo.
I also spoke with
Anna Babiak
and Nick Watkins
from St. Mary's College and Penn State, both majoring in biology and secondary education.
That's awkward. What do you remember being a difficult piece of your elementary math courses growing up? So for me, math never came naturally. I always had to work at it more than other subjects. It just wasn't always my favorite thing, so I wasn't always super engaged with it. I just felt like I was just kind of doing the problems, and once I got them, I felt good, but I would get very frustrated if I couldn't do it.
I remember just the lingo was really hard to comprehend because I had math teachers that were super, super high with their expectations, and so they automatically assumed that every student was coming in with high knowledge of what they were saying, and I had no idea what these words meant that they were spewing at my face. And I just remember sitting there feeling helpless, and I needed a math dictionary to tell me what they were talking about.
We then spoke about word problems and how they fit into math and how we used or perceived them in math classes.
In math, the teacher would always give a set of problems at the end where the first few would just be very clearly calculate this, and those were always really easy, and you would just go through them really quickly. And then there'd always be one or two word problems at the end, and those were always the harder questions.
Word problems definitely were harder than the regular equation problems that would be given in a standard math class or sometimes a basic physics class. But the problem I found wasn't to figure out what it was asking of me, but the steps in between is where I always tripped.
Can you define more about the steps in between?
Reading the problem, it would be clear to see what it was asking, what I needed to accomplish. But the processes involved getting in between were always fuzzy, and there were, I think, it was mentioned before, several different ways to go around it, and in some cases, one way was wrong.
Those last two voices were Sam Heim, a biochemistry major at Kent State University, and Will Carstens, a chemistry major at Michigan Tech. Though none of my interviewees were physics majors, all had taken some college-level physics that was required for their majors. I wondered why none of them had decided to major in physics after these classes, or what made the physics classes difficult for them.
It definitely was most challenging in physics this past semester, just sort of trying to understand the first step and getting the setup right, getting the free body diagram right.
Oh, I just could never figure out what they were asking. Being thrown into AP Physics without any other physics background, yeah, I just always struggled with piecing together kind of the definitions and the concepts, what letters stood for what, and then translating that into an actual problem. That was always very, very difficult for me.
The interviews were pretty loose after that. I simply asked questions based on some of the information they had given me. Everyone I talked to, though, was able to connect the wordiness or the language of physics to the difficulty of the classes in some way.
The physics homework was almost exclusively word problems. I found there was maybe one or two just simple plug-them-in equations. The physics homework always contained a degree of like you need to figure out a step on your own. They wouldn't feed you the information like a math class would.
Mm-hmm.
So there was always some guesswork involved, or intuitive guesswork.
My professor kind of structured our class a little bit more towards like physics literature. So he like took a long time to make sure that like we understood what questions we're asking, and then like he would go through a problem and explain like each individual thing and like say like, hey, this is what this means if you see it like this. But no, I agree, like even if there was such thing as like a physics or calculus literature course that could be like a prereq, like I think that would help. And I think it would also get rid of a lot of fear that like you automatically get just from hearing a problem, because then you'd be a lot more confident like attacking something like that.
I did not take physics in high school, and I remember coming into general physics last fall and just kind of being behind on even like the difference between acceleration and velocity really meant, and having to be at square one with that. And I felt like the rest of my peers were already had that down. So the vocab in physics is definitely higher level thinking than in just a calculus class or even an algebra class.
Yeah, I think setting up the problem is always the hardest part, which with like in physics or with word problems, like that's always where it is, because you have to go through like the information you're being given and figure out what you're supposed to do and how you're going to do it. I actually had my physics course in college that I took. We would get majority of the credit on a test question as long as we could set it up correctly, like regardless of what answer we actually got.
I remember in our physics class we had quizzes, and the answer had to be in terms of like the variables in the problem. Like it wasn't even about the number solution. It was about understanding how to rearrange your variables into the equation that you were using.
Right.
Symbolic equations, that's what it was called.
Right. So as you get older and you go through upper level physics courses, that doesn't change. The math operations that they expect you to be able to set up become harder and harder. And so while you're still learning that math in the same way that you would, and maybe you know the operation, it's just that it gets masked more in these upper level physics problems.
So when I tell you that you have 4 bananas and 2 apples, and I ask how many pieces of fruit you have, what gives you the knowledge to say 6? You know, of course, that bananas and apples are types of fruit, and you know that how many typically references a summation. It seems that it is possible that physics requires similar levels of knowledge with jargon, especially when you consider that physics does not make as much use of typical household terms. Physics problems, much like math word problems, tend to mask the operations that are required to solve them behind language. But hopefully, after my research this summer, a little bit of light will be shed on how to get past that language barrier that seems to divide physics and math.
Goodbye.